This special edition of EdTech Monday Africa is brought to you by the MasterCard Foundation in partnership with the World Bank.
Welcome to EdTech Monday Africa edition. I'm Julie Gishuru. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. Now, World Teachers' Day, which is October 5th, offers an opportune time to reflect on the ways in which education technologies can support teachers' work and consequently improve learning outcomes. The theme of the October edition of EdTech Monday Africa is aligned to the theme of World Teachers' Day, which is Teachers Leading in Crisis, Reimagining the Future. In many ways, teachers are the backbone of the education system, yet they face numerous challenges, from limited access to professional development opportunities and adequate remuneration to large class sizes and lack of access to key educational tools. This leads to motivation, and sometimes it's reflected in absenteeism. A study by UNICEF in 8 African countries found that up to 18% of teachers reported being absent from school or unable to deliver instruction while in school. Now, amid the pandemic, we have seen examples of teachers stepping up in remarkable ways to keep learning going. But we have also witnessed challenges, with many not equipped to deliver learning remotely. At a critical juncture that calls for the reimagining of education systems, and as the adoption of digital technology proliferates, it's important to consider what this means for teachers and how these advances can better serve teachers and enable them to be effective in their roles. We have an incredible panel to discuss this with us. Huma Kidwai is a senior education specialist at the World Bank. She's based in Kigali and leads the bank's basic education portfolio for Rwanda. Dr. Paul Birevu Muyinda is an associate professor of open, distance and e-learning and deputy principal at the College of Education and External Studies at Makerere University in Uganda. And Shamani Davis is the Chief Learning Officer at Instill Education, a private higher education institution dedicated to improving student outcomes. A very warm welcome to the panel. Thank you all for making time for this important conversation. I have to say, this one for me is big. I am such an advocate for teachers, and I'm sure in your own spaces, you all are too. Let's dive in by just taking a look at the challenges that you see from your perspective facing teachers. What do we really need to be looking at? What do we need to fix? Shamani, let me begin with you.
First of all, teachers are doing what they can, right? Because we know that our teachers want to do right by our children, and most, if not all, are doing what they can to ensure that they're providing opportunities for great learning and for choiceful life. But there's some huge gaps, especially in this time of the pandemic, where we are seeing so much more of the inequities exacerbated because of the lack of access and equitable access to technology. And in many ways, we are seeing teachers wanting to implement changes in their classrooms, but not quite understanding yet, okay, how can I bridge that gap between what I want to do and what resources I physically have. And so I think my fear and the things that we're trying to work on is how do we ensure that whatever we use, whatever technologies we use, strategies we use for teachers, that we ensure that we're not, that we're closing gaps of access, right? So we're creating opportunities for everyone and for all children, regardless of where they live, and access to money and resources can access that education.
Let me, Huma, come to you now for your perspective. What are the challenges that we really need to be addressing for teachers right now?
Let me respond to this question more from the systems perspective, since Shamani has focused a lot from what the teacher feels and experiences on a daily basis. And if I have to narrow down on, let's say, 2 broad challenges, one would be a fairly weak results orientation in our systems in which we work, and then inadequate alignment of investments on different aspects of service delivery. Now, for example, we are still struggling to ensure a harmonized approach to development where we sync different actors, different domains for a common outcome. So, for example, when we make efforts towards curriculum reform or changes in the framework or content development, we often don't align those changes with necessary improvements or simultaneous improvements in teacher development, in the teaching practice and instruction. Similarly, when we adopt technology by purchasing laptops and smart devices, we don't necessarily often make clear links and transitions towards instructional practices in the classrooms. So we continue to struggle with the processes and inputs to the extent that sector players and stakeholders often continue to work in silos and remain at the input and the output level and not go all the way towards the common outcome, which is related to learning and productivity. Now, digital technologies and solutions can help in improving teaching practice if we really recognize the value that they bring to the system and use technology for the right purpose. So whether it is for better management of education system or for connecting people at levels of operation better, for streamlining and speeding processes such as assessments, feedback loops, or for better tracking and monitoring of learning outcomes. Such deployment of technology can help teachers and their practice in the right way. And efficiencies in management should lead to more effective and impactful investments towards learning.
Thank you for that perspective. Dr. Paul, let me come to you next. And you are in the thick of it, so to speak. Keen to hear what your thoughts are on the most pressing challenges.
Yeah, thank you so much, moderator, for this very interesting question. Indeed, technology and teaching has come with some challenges. And these are lived challenges that I'm going to talk about. In trying to introduce technology into teaching and learning arena, we have faced the number one challenge that we've faced is teacher skills, both pedagogical and technological. Those two skills, our teachers have been traditional teachers, but technology has come. And the switch over to technology has been so abrupt, especially in developing countries like Uganda. When, for instance, we got COVID-19 in 2020 March, all our schools were closed, and teachers were supposed to migrate to using technology. But these teachers did not have any pedagogical skills on how to use technology to teach. They did not have any technical skills in the platforms and the different technologies. They did not know the different affordances of which technology that was being actually thrown at them to use. So you realize that teacher skills is a very big challenge in trying to introduce technology or trying to move to technology. Of course, the number two challenge that we have to address is the challenge of infrastructure. In town schools or city schools, you will find that the teachers there have access to technology, various technologies, but the majority of teachers who are located in upcountry areas, in areas with limited access, with limited electricity, they are really facing a lot of challenges. They cannot be able to access internet and so on. So infrastructure and which leads to access devices, internet connectivity is indeed another big challenge to our teachers.
Thank you all for that. I want to pull on a thread here, which is teacher skills, and let's look at what's being done already that's really working well. What examples maybe can you share of technology being leveraged to train teachers, to support their professional development, to equip them for the roles? What's really working well? Shamani, let me come to you on this.
Yeah, so I do want to go back to this point of the skills themselves, right? Because technology won't change the importance of great pedagogical approaches, right? We won't say, oh, you can by-step, how you engage learners and how you motivate them and how you actually explain concepts and filled inquiry. That's not going to change without thoughtful teacher preparation, without thinking through and developing a plan for teacher. What's expanding and what's changing is this idea that now how can I use technology as a means to empower and to elevate learning as opposed to be the tool that creates, it's just a medium, right? It's not the tool that creates learning. And I fear is quite often funders and policymakers, let's throw this technology at something or at someone, and magically all the issues will disappear, becomes a silver bullet to solve all the problems. What I do see working really well is whenever technologies are being implemented, is if folks really think about the context in which it's being implemented. For example, if I know that I'm working with teachers in an upcountry setting and I recognize that data is not going to always be accessible or is going to be is not going to be affordable, it's making sure that I have some online, offline system or tool where I can leverage learning. So I love the proliferation of platforms, these simple learning management systems that have started popping up throughout the continent, where we're getting people to design teacher-facing information and experiences. You only need to tap in and download once in a while. For example, I think of Chalkboard, for example, in Ghana, leveraging their work. And we've used that within Still for a bit of our work as well, recognizing that, you know what, if I'm really deep into an area where teachers won't have access to internet, let's have some way of downloading first. The other bit is making sure that we're thinking through not the inputs just for the sake of teacher inputs, but what is the impact on our learners afterwards? Are we actually going to see student learning, or is it this fun thing that we want to start implementing and say, yes, we have all these tablets in our schools? And so there are very simple solutions that teachers are using to develop each other. So they've started creating virtual professional learning communities through WhatsApp, through the phone change. I mean, there are folks in Uganda, in Educate, for example, they're starting to use just large conference calls to share best practices. That is technology. And that's the means and reality that, okay, what's happening in central Uganda, for example, may not be able to happen in the north. And so let's leverage what we have to make sure that that can take place. And so I do think I really respect the programs right now that are trying to contextualize what exactly is the need of the teacher in that region, and then what exactly is going to lead to direct student outcomes. What I do think is really hard is it's not an infrastructure issue with the lack of data itself, but teachers can't work on their own.
That's excellent. Huma?
I would reiterate what Chimane said about keeping the student learning as the main metric of success of programs. And you would see different programs in the countries, in the region, that deploy technologies in the ways that could be useful and instrumental in teaching practice. But oftentimes, I think it's important to realize that technology goes only so far, and it's as good as its execution. It can empower teachers, it can be used, but it can also be used to limit teachers and their agency and their judgment and creativity. So when done well, digital training tools should strengthen and enrich pedagogic practices, enable teachers to use different teaching styles, multimodal content to engage children with varying learning needs and levels and behaviors. It should also enhance interaction and imagination. And if we don't link all of that to learning outcomes, we keep churning out subject and theoretical experts and show high rates of success and completion of online trainings, not necessarily translating impact in classrooms.
Yes, I think I agree with my colleagues that we must look at the teacher first instead of throwing around technology, which has been a very common practice in many of our countries. Whenever they're talking about integration of technology in teaching and learning. So they will set up computer labs in schools. They'll give teachers, they'll give schools different kinds of technologies, but they will forget that the teacher is actually the person who is supposed to moderate the technology in the classroom or elsewhere. So we are first changing and looking at this kind of thing. And in Uganda, we are advocating actually for changing this perspective of looking at technology first, but first looking at the teachers. And that's why Uganda in 2019 actually passed a policy, a national teacher policy. And this national teacher policy actually emphasizes a lot to do with building the skills and the capacity of the teachers to integrate, to use technologies in teaching and learning, and to have new pedagogical approaches introduced in the classroom, and so on. So there are some specific examples indeed, but they may not be actually integrating technology within the teaching and learning, but they use the pedagogical principles of technology, of using distance education within the teaching and learning. And indeed, in Uganda, as you will see, most of the distance learning programs normally tend to look at education programs. So if somebody is thinking of setting up a distance learning program in the university or the teacher training institution, usually it will be an education program.
Let's talk a little bit through how we ensure what is available on technological platforms is really aligned to the learning needs within our different ecosystems at country level. You know, who would like to jump into that one first?
All right. I mean, it's an interesting question on how to link content with productivity in the country. And this question not only applies to teachers, but in general, when we work in the education sector, which has many different subsectors. You have early childhood education, you have primary, then secondary, and even within each level, you have lower and upper levels. But then you also have technical and vocational and skills development and higher education. Alignment of content, skills, competencies across these different levels is critical to ensure that the skills that we're producing in the early years have a role to play when the child progresses to higher levels of education. In fact, the skills that you develop at the lower levels should allow the child in the first place to progress through later levels. And we still struggle with that. Oftentimes, when we transition between different subsectors, let's say between pre-primary education and primary, many systems we see there's a disconnect between proficiency levels because we don't benchmark learnings by national or global standards of learning. The skills that a child in grade 3 is acquiring should be the building blocks for the skills and competencies in grade 4 and grade 5. And this requires a very thorough and serious work to be done with the curriculum planning, with the proficiency development, with creating of benchmarks on learning outcomes, and then link that with teachers. Because if we create these benchmarks for students at the curriculum level, but we don't connect that with the teaching level, then we are not ensuring that the teachers can teach the children at the right level.
Thank you. Paul, let me come to you on this as well.
Okay, what I can say is that technology-enabled learning has come and all the eyes on it. Unlike classroom-based education, which people think and have now thought that it's of quality and there's nothing wrong that can go on in the class, when technology-enabled learning sets in or came in, every eye was on it, meaning that there are so many people, that there's so many agencies that are actually looking at, are they meeting the quality that's required? Is it meeting the standard as we see maybe in the classroom? So there are so many agencies, government agencies, private sector agencies that are actually monitoring the quality of this online-based or technology-based learning. For example, government agencies. For us here in Uganda, we do have the National Curriculum Development Center, which has the mandate of ensuring the quality of the curriculum which is developed. And then in the Ministry of Education and Sports, we have the inspectorates. These go and inspect what's happening in schools and so on. So the same framework is being used to monitor the introduction of teaching and learning. At higher education level, we do have what we call the National Council for Higher Education, which actually regulates each and every step that we take. For instance, during COVID-19 time and pandemic, we had to get special permission to be able to roll out emergency open distance and e-learning programs, and also special permission to be able to roll out alternative assessment methods. So that's why I'm saying there are so many eyes that are actually looking at how we are doing things as we introduce technology in teaching and learning. And indeed, at higher education level, we have developed what we call quality assurance rubrics for technology-mediated teaching and learning. And these rubrics are actually indeed helping us to develop courses for teaching. They are helping us in ensuring quality at all levels. So because of these many eyes that are looking at this new, they call it a new approach to teaching and learning, in a way, we are also benefiting in the sense that no one can just bring in any form of technology-mediated learning without having questions being asked to them about quality.
Thank you. Shamani, I come to you with the same question, but I almost want to expand it a little bit, because earlier you did talk about the island of awesome and just how the best teachers are the ones who get burnt out the fastest. And so even when we look at this 360-degree approach and the quality of content, relevant content, on platforms, maybe even, wellness content, how to cope, how to manage. What are your views on this, and what should we be doing?
Yeah, I mean, we at Instill, we are creating, we had to start creating modules on managing and, managing well-being during remote learning, but also well-being during uncertainty, because there came a time where, I know personally, hence all the plants and everything that's in this room, being stuck at home. And can you imagine being a child, just not experiencing, having interaction with friends, with family, the routine and structure of school? Like, we make things up around us to bring us some kind of joy and happiness. We started thinking through, what are the things that we need to do to ensure teachers have some access to start thinking about their own well-being before they start thinking about their students' well-being, and making sure they're not, pouring out from an empty cup, so to speak. And so we create those modules, because you can't just talk about pedagogy and assessments and data-driven instruction without taking care of the people who are physically in front of our learners every single day. And so we have a series or a pathway of learning experiences, just working and focusing on that, both from a teacher, taking care of myself first, monitoring students' well-being and reporting. We know we're not psychologists, but we can see certain, patterns and signals, and we work with an ed psychologist, start thinking through what to look for. But also making sure that school leaders, we provide training both for school leaders and for teachers. So making sure school leaders have systems in place to start thinking through, okay, when routines are broken or when we're noticing trends and absenteeism in our teachers, what are some of the plans that we can come up with in our schools to support them? So I certainly agree that just the need of, just the center of the conversation here is, the answer is not the technology. The answer is human-centered design and response, right? So if we know the humans who are using the tools that we're creating, like what do they need right now? And certainly during COVID, we need so much more than just the tech and the internet and the data and the fancy toolboxes. So in many ways, we just have to start thinking about, like, who are our stakeholders and making sure we're taking care of them, and making sure that our stakeholders is really not really them. Our stakeholders is not the teacher, right? Like, I say this all the time, I love teachers, but we're here for children. Like, if our education system cannot create a choice-filled life for children, what are we doing, right? And so I do want to go back to this question, or to the response Huba, shared, that we start off, we know, like, yes, grades and all this is made up, right? We've been following the same structure and tools for centuries at this point. But there are certain benchmarks. There are certain milestones. Like, we need to be very careful that we are training teachers to watch out for. A child who cannot read by grade 3 is not likely to be able to really engage in education moving forward. So those are children we want to really monitor and support to ensure that they're not dropping out, right? We do know that a child who's experienced trauma without counseling and support at certain points in their life, without the support, are going to be a bit higher risk of dropping out.
What are the 2 or 3 things that you would land on these tables in terms of the needs for policy shift to ensure, that first of all, the quality, the relevance, the human-centered design is there, but that we're able to equip our leaders within learning institutions and our teachers as well, and that we're able to deliver for our key stakeholders, which are our children, our students, our learners. What are the 2 or 3 things you put on the table in front of them and say, this needs to happen? Paul, on this one, let me start with you.
Yes, thank you so much. I think if I'm at such a round table with the policy decision makers and I'm representing my country, Uganda, I won't speak for other countries. The first thing that I'll put across is ensuring that we have a national policy of ICTs in education. That's very, very important, because at the moment in my country, we don't yet have this. And many things are not going well simply because we don't have this policy at national level. Because if we don't have this policy at national level, the funding for these things and the guidance of how to integrate and so on won't be there. So the putting in place policy at national level, and then also policies at institutional levels that, of course, speak to the overarching national policy, that would be very, very important. The next thing I would put on table will be encouraging private-public partnerships. Private-public partnerships, because as I've said, infrastructure is very, very important for ensuring that our teachers can be able to have access to technology, they can be able to connect in and so on. But governments are not the ones providing the telecommunication services. These telecommunication services are being provided by private sector. And so how do we get the government, the public sector, talking with the private sector to ensure that, for example, there is maybe a subsidy of communication charges, subsidy in infrastructure, devices, connectivity devices, and so on. And then I would also put in place, I would also ask for policies on continuous professional development for teachers.
I really want to echo in on CPD. I cannot stress enough, just as a profession, just how much we are so far behind from other professions in teaching, in ensuring that we have thoughtful professional development. It's continuous learning. I had a brief stint in my life as an attorney, and in many places, thinking through maintaining your bar, maintaining your licensure is such an important part of who you are. And it's not always done by some random outsider who's coming in to tell you, do this, do that. Instead, we often learn from each other. And in many ways, when we say CPD, continuous professional development in teaching, it's almost like this outsider coming in to tell us what to do better in our own school. When I know my community, I know my children, I know our context. Why am I not the one developing this for teachers here? So, and I'm not saying that we can't do the research and lean on outsiders to get insights. But I would really push policymakers to think through and quite frankly, I'm not one to think that change happens through policy, right? It happens at a grassroots level, and the infrastructure support that we can propel that and accelerate that. But I do think we have to start thinking through how can we make teachers, right, and local teachers, local school leaders start owning the development in their schools and in their districts and in their communities of practice, because they have more knowledge in their work. The other piece that part of that CPD framework is we have so much new research today, especially neuroscience, brain development and learning, and we are not tapping into any of that. We're tapping into so little of that. So this whole concept of universal design for learning, which we know when people, there are learning gaps, when people, whether they're not motivated or not engaged or can't act or express in their learning, we know that there are things that we can do to help, and we can intervene, and we're not using professional practice communities to share best practices with each other. And we have to get to a place where we're thinking, we're codifying those best practices and calling first, codifying, and really getting very practical. Because what teachers are very good at is, I don't want to see this long 400-page policy document. What I want to see is, what do I do step by step in my school and my classroom? Or what do I do step by step when I talk to this parent about this really harsh scenario that just happened?
Coming third, I can only complement what Paul and Shimani have said. And I think if I'm in the room with policymakers, it's important for us to discuss if they completely understand the role of the teacher in the country. And it's really because oftentimes we may assume that people working in the education sector at the policy and the leadership level connect very closely with the frontline workers of the sector who are teachers. But I think that connection is often it requires work and facilitation. It's not very obvious and automatic. I think policymakers and leaders need to be reminded, need to understand that teachers are members of a larger population. And as much as we want to burden them with labels like they're agents of change or they're leaders for the future, they're influenced by the changes around them in the same way as any one of us. So I think an important aspect of the success of use of digital technology in classrooms, for the success of useful integration of technology in classroom, a lot of that has to do with the teacher's own beliefs and attitudes about the relevance of technology to students' future, to students' learning, and to their own lives. So this assumption that everybody is on board with the agenda of digitization, the agenda of progressive use of ICT in education, I think this assumption is misleading, and it needs to be worked on. Hence, as a policymaker, as somebody who works with policymaker levels at a higher level, I think an important discourse to be facilitated has to do with how to empower teachers by beginning to understand their motivations and reservations to use ICT, and then begin capacity development from that perspective. And this also requires us to work on how to design education policies, strategies to promote digital skills amongst educators and the rest of the population. This requires a whole government approach to openly demonstrate how everyday life of individuals in a country are increasingly relying on digital accessibility for management and access to health, money, jobs, protection, etc. And teachers deserve the assurance that education technology cannot replace them. It's there to augment good teaching. It's not to replace their jobs. It's not to show that a teacher with an iPad can follow instructions and become a good teacher, or which is often the direction that many of us tend to go when we tend to overestimate the role of technology beyond the role that the teacher has to play. And the way we talk about technology in education space needs to create a positive relationship between teachers, students, and computers. If we're creating insecurities and this negative connotation about what technology can do, how technology is there to even turn a bad teacher into a good teacher, I think we are causing the sector greater harm than good. So if in the same space with policymakers, it's important that we do more about creating useful and positive connections between technology and teachers and human resource and the systems. And I think this is easier said than done, but requires to be acknowledged as an area of work first.
Thank you. Just such a rich, incredible conversation. I want us to close with one simple question. Let's visualize the future. And, let's imagine that we got the policies right, we got them in place, but also the application on the ground. We were able to ensure we were supporting, infrastructure was present, quality of learning for teachers themselves as well as their own learners. All this is happening, and it's circular, it's continuous, it's ongoing. And, what would this mean for Africa if we got this right? So in many ways, we look at, digital money and the payment system and what it's done to transform realities in Africa for small businesses, for everybody actually. What could this mean if we get this right in education and technology really and education do come together and work for both schools and administration and teachers, but also for the learners? What could it do to the continent? Huma, let me start with you.
For me, if I envision things going the right way, as the scenario that you have laid out for us, that would mean any day, any given time, I can move one child from a school in Rwanda to a school in Kenya or a school in India, and the child should be able to adjust, adapt, and learn in the same way. Because it's about global learning. If the whole concept about digital and globalized learning is to create equity in learning outcomes across the globe, then our systems, if operating the right way, should allow for that easy transition across the board. And this is a very simplistic response to your question of what the world could look like if we are moving equitably and using technology and policy for the right purpose. For me, it's about, if I limit my response to technology, then digital accessibility, that every child is able to benefit from the work, the investments, the policies equally, including children with disability. So following a universal design framework where every child, regardless of abilities, it's not just about children with disabilities, it's about children with varying abilities, are able to benefit from the investments in the sector. It's also about ensuring that the market is responding to the demands in the sector. You can work with the policymakers, with educators. What about people who are producing literacy materials in the country? Let's say publishers, children's books publishers. If we have standards, if we have quality assurance systems, then all the content that are being developed in the system, in the country, inside and outside school, allows for that accessibility for all. And this requires us to work both at the market level, provider level, governments, and schools. So yeah, in an ideal circumstance, I would say everybody has a role to play and everybody is contributing and complementing to that role. And if I move from Rwanda to South Africa any day, my child in grade 3 can easily move and shift to the content in another school because we're talking about similar competencies, similar proficiency levels. So that's what we can assure. And teachers should have a very important, they should feel confident and secure in their own skin, in their own role to play. And sometimes when we talk about technology and policies, we take that ownership, that identity away from them as to what they can do for the country and what they are doing for the country, for the nation, for the region, for the planet at large. And I think doing things the right way allows teachers to find that space, to find the contribution that they are making, have pride in it. Shimane pointed out something as logistical and simple as paying the teachers what they deserve and at time, and how far that can actually go in ensuring that teachers feel that they are as important as any other professional in the country to do the job that they have been assigned to do.
That is the importance of envisioning the future, because we must know where we want to go in order to ensure we get there. Paul, your thoughts? What could it mean for Africa if we get all this right?
I think if such a situation is prevailing, education will become a pay and take away commodity, meaning that people will be able to access any type of education, any type of institution in the world, within their countries, wherever. So there will be no barriers to education, because if I want my child to go to Harvard, for instance, or if I want to go and do teacher training in a very nice or very qualityful university in America, there will be no barrier to me because I will just access it and be able to be there, because now I will have the technology, the access, and everything will be available. So there will be no barrier to education, and therefore I would be able to pick whatever education modules or whatever I want, and then be able to consume them. So it will be education, therefore, is going to be a pay and take away commodity. Learners from any part of the world will be able to access education of their choice. So that's the beauty about it. The visa restrictions won't be there. So the world is going to be more of indeed a global world, a global village with virtual movements that are not restricted. Then education will become so resilient. You will see that the most affected sector during COVID-19, other sectors were affected, but to me, in my thinking, I think that the most affected sector is the education sector, because it has not been resilient. But when that scenario that you've given comes on board, then the education sector will become more resilient, and it will not be easily disrupted by pandemics such as COVID-19 and other catastrophes. So, and there will be enhanced networking and collaboration. So there will be increased learning and working with different people of different races in different places. So that means that knowledge transfer and partnerships will increase. And so I look forward to seeing that particular ideal situation.
Paul, you gave an example there of, maybe someone's seeking to pursue a course in America. Well, maybe they'll be looking to pursue courses in Africa and they won't need the visa for Africa. So they'll be joining, our platforms here on the continent to learn. Shamani, let me come to you. Final word from you.
And that's exactly it, because many people do, right? I'm Jamaican, but I went to school in the US and worked in the US. And for me, it has always been life's purpose to what do you do to make Black people have access? And Black folks won't have access until Africa has full access and meaning in the world. And surely painting the continent as one is a broad thing, but it's not just for Africans, it's also for all of those in the diaspora as well who want to have meaning and purpose. But it's really hard to do that without an education, without choice. So I do think what education would do for the continent and for those who want to live on the continent and engage with the continent is create choice and meaning, not just for self, but for community. I have so many cousins and siblings who, because of that, a lack of the access and education, cannot make the choice that I made, right? I had all the education in the world and all the access to great resources in the world, which allowed me to leave Jamaica and to live here and to lead a purposeful life here. And so I do think we have to start thinking through, at the end of the day, we want our children to lead meaningful choice-filled lives, but not just for self. I think a part of what we can think about as we train children and develop young people is, what does that mean for your community? It means that educated people don't take the BS that comes oftentimes with what happens to succumb to society and succumb to life. So it means that we're better able to fight corruption. It means that we're better able to say no to deals that don't work in the interest of people. It means that we're able to start our own businesses. It means that we're able to actually say, yes, I hear you and that's education, but my local traditions and my local knowledge is also important, and telling those stories as well. It means that we learn how to value our families and take care of each other. It means that we improve our healthcare systems. It means that we create access for people who don't have, and we make sure that it becomes somewhat affordable. The one good thing I can say about Jamaican education is it's pretty cheap compared to, I think anything compared to education is cheap. The best school in Jamaica is not the fraction of the cost of low to medium cost school in Kenya. And that's a problem, right? Because you're going to see a class divide, in who has access to certain types of learning, and therefore certain job opportunities, and therefore certain business opportunities in the country, and it gets more stratified. So for me, it's not just, as someone from the diaspora. And as a Pan-African, it means getting people excited to come, go to University of Nairobi, go to Makerere, go to Cape, go to schools here and experience and learn and develop programs and community development here. Because there's some things that I try to explain to folks when I go home. I miss Kenya. I don't carry cash. Like having a pesa is like the most liberating thing on earth. I get frustrated and annoyed when I'm at home or in the US because why hasn't someone thought about this, right? But those are the things where we come to value this system works because it was developed for folks for whom it makes sense, right? And oftentimes it starts working for other people. So if we have schools from early childhood all the way, and I don't think learning ends, right? I'm still learning, I'm still developing, and I'm still sharing and teaching as well. I think we can do so much on the continent to just start thinking of talking, how I think the pandemic has taught us, fake news is real, but how do we get people to shut down conversations that don't make sense or a disservice to others? It's through learning and be able to share ideas with each other. And I think education can do that for folks, is to make meaning and purpose in our lives and communities.
It's great to be bold about our ambitions and dreams. And so thank you all. What an incredible panel. Just before we close, we've been asking the question on social media platforms, what are the greatest challenges affecting teachers and how can technology play a role in supporting teachers? Let's take a look at some of your responses. Thank you so much for connecting with us online. You can follow the MasterCard Foundation handles, the handles of the World Bank Group as well, and Young Africa Works. And once again to the panel, thank you so much for your insight, for your passion as well. I think it came out really clear, and bold is the way to go. Be safe and be well, and we all continue to work together to make this big dream happen. Thank you so much.
This special edition of EdTech Monday Africa is brought to you by the MasterCard Foundation in partnership. EdTech Monday Africa is brought to you by the MasterCard Foundation in partnership.